And that brings us to the next one, which is slope. There's another effect that has to do with irrigation. The minute we start putting a gradient on that water, when it hits the ground, it has two choices: soak in or go sideways down the slope. Runoff. You know, that terrible word in our industry is runoff. It's one thing we try to totally avoid. And the steeper the slope, the more potential for runoff. So the steeper that angle gets, the more chance that water droplet has of hitting on the surface and staying on the surface and running down the face of the surface. So one of our objectives always is to be able to apply water at a rate so that it's slow enough for the slope to intake the water, and the droplets have to be small enough so they don't have so much impact as when they hit that they actually have a force, an angle force, that'll get them rolling down the face of that surface. So too big of droplets can all of a sudden become a real problem with slope. And obviously the steepness of it. Then another thing that we can do with slope is to get some kind of crop cover on it. Now we see severe slope irrigation on golf courses. That's a classic. We're going to see it. Every golf course we look at is going to have some very steep ground. It's by design. They want it. They want a lot of elevation difference. They want to have side hill lies. They want to give the players options of where to hit the ball according to the terrain to make the course play easier or harder. And in the process, those of us that have to put in the systems to match up what the needs of the golfer are have to deal with that. You know, we got to be able to get those slopes, number one, stabilized so that once we get the turf growing on them, then we get a ground cover, then we don't have too much trouble. But we still have the problem with slope of keeping the water on the slope. So there are ways to help establish and maintain side hills and keep the water as uniform as possible. Now the people that go out and just run the water and make one set a night and walk away from it, the top of the slope's always going to be drier than the bottom of the slope. Some of that water, by gravity, is going to work its way down the slope. And by the time you get to the middle of summer, the valley's going to be plenty wet out there on the courses, and the hills are going to be plenty dry, if that's the way it's watered. Well, the technique is to run a cycle and let it soak in. Come back, run another cycle, let it soak in. If you're going to put on a 15-minute set a night on a golf course head, maybe make it in 3 5-minute sets and space them 2 hours apart. So you run 5 minutes, and then it shifts to another head out somewhere else on the course, and for 2 hours, that 5 minutes of water gets a chance to soak in. So that 2 hours later, another 5 minutes of water is passed on that area. It gets a chance to soak in for 2 more hours before you come back for the third pass and put 5 more minutes of water on. Now we got our whole 15 minutes, but we've done it in stages so that it had a chance to soak in. Because what happens is the intake rate, once you saturate the top little bit, starts to slow down. So what we do is we let it soak in so that the intake rate can speed back up again. Wait a couple hours, and we can apply another batch of water, and it'll hold in place a lot better than if we just put all 15 minutes on at one time. Okay. Another thing we do with slope if we're in agriculture is contour farming. Grow crops on the contour to help our application rates. What it'll do is it'll stop the water from running downhill. We go across the slope with all of our rows. So that instead of going up and down, making a ditch for the water just to race right down the hill, we do everything across the slope. And so the water keeps hitting a stop every time it comes to another row. It doesn't run down the slope. Now that's a little tricky when you're growing certain crops. Certain farming practices don't allow us to do that. For example, you don't harvest potatoes across the contour of a very much of a slope. Potato diggers aren't made to dig on a side. They're made to dig level. You can go up and down, but they can't go side hill. So you have to grow potatoes on the flat effectively, or up and down the hill, because the harvesters just can't handle the side hills. So you're stuck with either growing them on flat ground or using another cultural practice. And that cultural practice is called pitting. They go in and they pit each of the rows. So there's ways of conquering some of these things. And in this case, every couple of feet, they have a paddle that comes in and takes a scoop in the middle of the row and makes a little dam. And another 2 feet, paddle scoops and makes another little dam. And it's called a dam or diker is the manufacturer. And they just make little reservoirs right down the row. Every couple of feet, there's a hole in the furrow, and then a dam. So every other foot, there's a little dam, a scoop of ground, and then a depression, and a scoop and a depression. So down that furrow, you're going to find looks like little reservoirs, little mini reservoirs. And that stops the water from running down the hill. And it works very well. And it's become a real tremendous asset to any of the row crops, particularly corn and potatoes in this part of the country. But slope is the problem, and the soil type. You add tight soils and steep hills, and you have the worst conditions possible for any kind of surface irrigation.